Hi, Andrew from Sachs, and welcome to video number 3 in our 6-video series on inclusion. Earlier in the sequence, told you a really important theory about what makes people prejudiced, and we proved this theory in video number 2. In this video, we'll be talking about tolerance and intolerance in organisations, and then we'll be wrapping up the research section of this video series, talking about key drivers of tolerance and intolerance. Firstly, I want to talk about some diversity competencies. And the idea of diversity competencies is that people can acquire competencies to make them better in dealing with issues of diversity. And so one of the diversity competencies is this concept of motivation. In other words, does the person believe that it's important to be inclusive and welcoming of people with diverse backgrounds? So a key diversity competency is this motivation characteristic. Then there's a characteristic of knowledge. Does this person know enough about other cultures to respond effectively? Not just cultures, of course. It relates to things like sexual preferences. Should I say that? You might have seen the ABC TV show if you're in Australia or New Zealand called You Can't Ask That. And that's all about questions which in general would be considered to be unacceptable because, well, diversity knowledge, that competency would tell you shouldn't ask those things. And then there's a question of behaviour. Does the person modify their behaviours in order to relate to people from other cultures? Now that's an interesting one. Do I modify my behaviours in order to relate to people from other cultures or from other sexual preference backgrounds or whatever? Now you can understand why that could be a good thing because I'm accommodating. On the other hand, if it's not done well, it could be a negative thing, right? Where you were doing stuff, you were modifying your behaviour in such a way that you feel stilted. Or, for instance, when people are hard of hearing, people sometimes shout at them and thinking that they're doing the right thing. Whereas many people who have problems with hearing become very offended with that. So anyway, we'll address that question in the research findings to see whether modifying behaviours is always a good thing. So finding number 7 is about diversity motivation, and we find that varies by age. Now, findings number 1 to 6, by the way, were in the immediately previous video if you're interested in finding out about that. But ultimately this echoes one of the findings that we had in the previous video, which is that cultural competency of motivation is lower in older people than it is in younger people. And I think that it's exposure to diversity which causes that. People who grow up in a more monocultural society are less likely to believe that it's important to be welcoming of diversity. And of course, the other thing is that recent education has educated people that it's a good thing to do. So no doubt those two factors contribute to causing people who are younger to be more welcoming. Diversity climate. Now, diversity climate is all about a measurable perception that the organisation tries hard to foster diversity and eliminate discrimination. So an organisation that has a good diversity climate is one where the employees believe that the organisation cares about diversity and it wants them to care about diversity. Now, there's also good, strong research evidence that organisations that have high diversity climate tend to perform better. So morally, it's a good thing to do, but it also can contribute to your commercial outcomes. So let's look at diversity climate in terms of different industry groups. And what we find is that the lowest is wholesale trade and manufacturing. Agriculture, forestry and fishing tend to be quite low in terms of inclusiveness from a diversity climate point of view. But the highest, interestingly, is mining. Now, education, health and community services probably don't surprise you too much. Interestingly, electricity, gas and water services, utilities in effect, also tend to be high. Property and business services tend to be high. Actually, the electricity, gas and waste services tend to be kind of sophisticated organisations these days, so that's probably not so surprising. But mining's an interesting one, isn't it? I guess if you asked people about the most inclusive industries in the world, not many people would pick out mining. But in fact, when I've spoken to people from the mining sector, they explained it to me as follows. Mining is incredibly multinational for a start. So if you are a member of the mining community, let's say you're a mining engineer or something like that, quite often people from Guatemala come to Australia and people from Australia go and work in Chile and people who work from Chile go and work in Papua New Guinea, let's say. So it tends to be quite multicultural in that sense. And this individual's theory, or a couple of people that I spoke to in the mining sector, say that's one of the drivers of it. But we do see that there are differences, aren't there, in different industry sectors about the levels of inclusion that they have. So there are some further research findings about tolerance and intolerance within organisations, the fact that there's a thing called diversity climate and there are also diversity competencies. The next video is a very short one which focuses on key drivers of tolerance and intolerance, and in effect it wraps up what we saw in videos number 2 and 3, and it gives you some overall findings about the kinds of things that are likely to cause a person to be tolerant and intolerant. And then in videos number 5 and 6 we're going to focus on the issue of how to create a more tolerant and inclusive workforce through leadership, and also some really practical interventions that you might undertake. So join us to find out more about what causes people to be intolerant in video number 4.